All right, let us transition back to today's online symposium because now I have the pleasure of introducing our second speaker who was scheduled to be with us in Gettysburg last November and has been patient enough to bear with us as we made our way through our Zoom mini forums and got to this midway point here on May 15th. His time is now, and we are happy indeed to have him back. Richard Striner is a professor of history at Washington College and the author of a number of wonderful books, including Lincoln and Race for the Southern Illinois University series. I find that a very valuable book. Lincoln's Way, How Six Great Presidents Created American Power, and Father Abraham, Lincoln's Relentless Struggle to End Slavery, about which he spoke to the Lincoln Forum some years back. The new book, which you see on your screen, is Summoned to Glory. Great cover art, so I don't really even have to repeat it. The Audacious Life of Abraham Lincoln, in which Dr. Striner strikes back at the longtime stereotype that holds that Lincoln was moderate, passive, and conservative. Dr. Striner shows us a different side of Lincoln, one who wields power brilliantly, daringly, and how better to say it, audaciously. The book provides a long needed, I think, reboot on what we are to make of Lincoln's style and substance. And it could not have been argued more originally or more compellingly. Um, so it's great to have him here. I must add that you will have to believe us, those of you in the audience, that we reached far and wide, literally coast to coast, for our two speakers this afternoon. But we did end up with one who lives near Pasadena, California, and our next speaker who lives in Pasadena, Maryland. I guess the prerequisite for this forum is Pasadena roots. But I looked up the word Pasadena on Wikipedia, and we know how definitive Wikipedia is. Apparently it means key to the valley in Chippewa. So thanks to Ron and now Rick for providing us the key that opens new doors to Abraham Lincoln. Please welcome Rick Striner.
Greetings from Pasadena, Maryland. I've been wanting for a long time to write a full-scale biography of Lincoln that emphasized his audacity. It took audacity to change the world the way Lincoln did, and he changed the world, changed it powerfully. It is time to challenge the widespread, stubbornly persistent stereotype that Lincoln was somehow a moderate or moderate unionist, as some put it. Lincoln, in my view, by his years of greatness, by the time of his presidency, was a strategist par excellence, an orchestrator of power, whose genius was to summon his power to prevent worst case possibilities and to support, dynamically support, best case possibilities. I want to suggest to you that there was a fundamental radicalism in Lincoln's House divided speech, a radicalism in his advocacy of the free soil platform of the Republican Party in 1860. No more compromises on slavery and no more slave states, no more. Now, that was the general position of people within the free soil movement and Republicans, except when push came to shove in early 1861, January, February, during the secession crisis in Washington. Compare the steadfast position that Lincoln took with the behavior of his nearest competitor for the Republican nomination, William Seward, who had Until then, a reputation in the South as a fearsome abolitionist because of his irrepressible conflict speech. As soon as the secession threat became real, William Seward was melting all over himself to appease the seceders, but not Lincoln, who wrote to one Republican member of Congress and told him to hold on as with a chain of steel. That was not moderation, that was strength, a radical kind of strength. And I'm going to suggest to you now that there was a comparable radical strength in Lincoln's unionism. It is all very well to talk about saving the Union, as Lincoln himself did over and over again during the Civil War. But let me give you a different point of view as to what Lincoln was doing in, quote, saving the Union, unquote. What he meant to do was to kill the emerging pro-slavery Confederate nation. He meant to kill it through total war. That was audacious. The examples of Lincoln's audacity could be multiplied almost indefinitely. Here's one that not many people apparently know about. After Lincoln had worked behind the scenes to get the 13th Amendment out of Congress, he floated the idea privately within the councils of his cabinet to ask Congress to appropriate $400 million to pay the slave states to ratify the 13th Amendment. Can you imagine that? Have you ever heard of a president even toying with the idea to pay states to ratify, pay them off, pay states to ratify a constitutional amendment? Surely that must itself be unconstitutional, but nothing in the Constitution prohibits it. So Lincoln was quite prepared to go ahead and do it. His cabinet didn't like it much, so he shelved it. He might have revived it later. As I say, the examples of Lincoln's brilliant audacity could be multiplied almost indefinitely. And yet down the years, we have had one biographer after another say things like one biographer said in the 1990s. He said that Lincoln was essentially passive, that he had a lifelong reluctance to take the initiative and make bold plans. About a half century earlier, another biographer wrote in the 1950s that Lincoln's mind moved slowly, as the minds of country people typically do. The moderate tag for Lincoln is to this day extremely prevalent in academia. Lincoln as a moderate, but moderate compared to what? Well, compared to the abolitionists, compared to the radical Republicans, compared to African American activists, both free and enslaved. And there was a difference between the role Lincoln played and the roles that those other people played. But what the generators of the moderate myth do not, in my judgment, seem to appreciate is the way that Lincoln acted in synergistic partnership with those who were more outwardly radical. He, as president, developed a kind of insider-outsider orchestration with them. In January 1862, two abolitionists came to the White House to pay a call upon Lincoln. They were received very courteously. Moncure Daniel Conway and William Henry Channing. We have this account from Conway's memoirs, which were published in 1904. If Conway's memories were trustworthy, and the abolitionist Wendell Phillips, after meeting with Lincoln several months later, wrote of a similar encounter with Lincoln in a letter that he wrote. Lincoln actually told these abolitionists that he wanted them to continue their agitations and that they should feel free to call him any name they chose to. Don't spare me, he said. He wanted them to attack him, to besmirch his reputation, because he could put that pressure to use as leverage. Have you ever heard of any other president encouraging his allies to actually call him names, or critics for that matter, to attack him, trash his reputation? This was the mind of a strategist at work. And there are many, many examples of Lincoln's meetings with abolitionist critics, radical Republicans during the Civil War that reveal uh, a similar mental process. In August 1863, when Lincoln met with the Black abolitionist Frederick Douglass, he explained to Douglass that the method he was using had to be incremental. You had to bring the public along with you. Uh, when Lincoln met with Conway and Channing, he used a folksy anecdote comparing his own approach to the slavery question during the Civil War with a crafty druggist who connived to spike a soda unbeknownst to himself. You see, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. This is the Lincoln that I came to know over long years of study. It was a Lincoln whose strategy was to outmaneuver racists and promote Black uplift through covert actions that required deniability. In 1864, Lincoln wrote a letter to the newly elected Free State governor of Louisiana, largely under military occupation. Michael Hahn was that man's name, in which he suggested to him off the record to consider the possibility of phasing in Black voting rights when Louisiana's constitution was being withdrawn. And Lincoln said at the end, this is a suggestion to you alone, not to the public. Yes, Lincoln knew the ways of secrecy. He knew the ways of deception. He deliberately created the moderate myth about himself to conceal his behind the scenes maneuvers. Lincoln was a master of deception, and it's very interesting to read some of the reminiscences of his fellow attorneys about his technique as a trial lawyer. Here's one who wrote that Lincoln, quote, had the manner of treating his antagonist with such perfect fairness as to make the jury and bystanders think that he could not be induced to take advantage of him, a manner which was the hell-firedest lie that was ever acted, because the very fairness he assumed was an ambuscade to cover up a battery with which to destroy the opposing counsel, and so skillfully laid to, that after it had done its work, only occasionally would the defeated party, and almost never would the uninitiated, discover the deception, unquote. Lincoln's fellow attorney, friend, and political collaborator, Leonard Swett, wrote after Lincoln's death that he was, quote, as wise as a serpent in the trial of a case, but I tell you, I have got too many scars from his blows to certify that he was as harmless as a dove. Swett went on to share the following anecdote of his own, quote, as he entered trial where most lawyers object, he would say he reckoned it would be fair to let this in or that. And sometimes when his adversary could not quite prove what Lincoln knew to be the truth, he would say he reckoned it would be fair to admit the truth to be so-and-so. When he did object to the court after he heard his objections answered, he would often say, well, I reckon I must be wrong. But by giving away 6 points and carrying the 7th, he carried his case. And the whole case hanging on the 7th, he traded away everything which would give him the least aid in carrying that. Anyone who took Lincoln for a simple-minded man would very soon wake up on his back in a ditch, unquote. Yes, this is the Lincoln I came to know. Lincoln created the moderate myth to a great extent himself. But the moderate myth was also enshrined after the Civil War in the late 19th, early 20th century, after the racist backlash against Reconstruction created the foundations of the Jim Crow South, and in many parts of the North, the Jim Crow North. The consensus was that the Civil War had been a tragedy, but a magnificent tragedy with glory and heroism and sacrifice and honor on both sides. That thank heavens the Union had been saved. And so it was that Lincoln was known preeminently as the savior of the Union, much more than as the great emancipator. And the truth of that can be seen in the way the Lincoln Memorial was designed and constructed. Um, Behind the statue of Lincoln are those wonderful lines composed by Royal Cortizos: "In this temple, as in the hearts of the people, for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever." And in front of those lines sits the magnificent sculpture of Lincoln by Daniel Chester French. Lincoln seated, Lincoln enthroned. And the conception of this sculpture was and is magnificent. It is iconic. It's a gorgeous, powerful image. But in some ways, to me, it's an unfortunate image, because think of the subliminal effects of this sculpted iconography. Lincoln is sitting down, he's pondering, and he's waiting, isn't he? Waiting and waiting and waiting. Is it any wonder that amidst general perceptions, this notion of Lincoln as a quintessential patient moderate has sunk in? Well, compare that image, that notion of Lincoln, to the Lincoln who made me sit bolt upright when I first read the transcription of this speech, July 10th, 1858, a speech that was delivered off the cuff and taken down by journalists in attendance in shorthand. And they also recorded the audience reactions, which was fortunate, because the text, complete with the audience reactions, makes it very, very clear that this was an electrifying performance, that Lincoln, when he wished to, could be a spellbinder. Imagine the scene. He is standing on a window balcony at the Tremont House Hotel in Chicago. It's night. Torches are blazing. He is looking down upon a crowd of thousands, and he is talking about the meaning, the innermost meaning of the Declaration of Independence as it applies to the slavery question. Now, I'm going to naturally dramatize this as I read it aloud. Bear with me. I should like to know if taking this old Declaration of Independence, which declares that all men are equal upon principle, and making exceptions to it, where will it stop? If one man says it does not mean a Negro, why not another say it does not mean some other man? If that declaration is not the truth, let us get the statute book in which we find it and tear it out. Who's so bold to do it? Voices, me, no one. If it is not true, let us tear it out. No, no, unquote. No, Lincoln could be a spellbinder. I can only imagine, what he looked like in action and sounded like in action. But this amazing text makes it very, very clear. This man could be a fiery speaker driven by fiery passions. Now, my dream memorial to Abraham Lincoln, if I could design one, would feature the same beautiful architecture, the same gorgeous sculptural technique of Daniel Chester French. But Lincoln would not be sitting, he would be standing tall. He would be in motion, striding toward us, hand extended, beckoning to us, and his message to us would be arise. I'm going to give my audience lots of time to ask me questions and answers. I hope I have provoked you sufficiently to generate questions. So I would now like to open the floor to those. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. That was wonderful. This is I think, a really important new interpretation of Lincoln, away from the idea of him as a moderate to as an audacious president, an audacious leader. I want to remind the viewers at home, you can post questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then I will be able to give them to Rick. We've got one so far. This one came in partway through your talk, so you did address it, but I want to ask it again so that you have a chance to sort of elaborate on it a little bit more. This came from Ed Epstein, and he said, why do you think the view of Lincoln as a moderate has become so prevalent? Does it have to do with the view of him as savior of the Union rather than as great emancipator? And so you addressed that part, but if you could sort of talk about why did this view become so prevalent?
In addition to the reasons, the suggestions that I shared already, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with this at all. We, as Americans, need to feel inspired by the ideals of our democracy, and especially at a moment like this in American history, when things have been so horrid. We need and want to look back and find inspiration in the founding fathers, find inspiration in Lincoln, find inspiration in figures from the past we regard as heroic. And as I say, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But especially in times of turmoil and division and hatred, the side of Lincoln that Ron White emphasized, and it's those qualities were also very, very true. We all have many faceted personalities. There are many sides to Lincoln, many moods to Lincoln, and the side of him that did emphasize healing and reconciliation and forgiveness, and those were all very, very genuine qualities in Lincoln. Genuine, authentic, heartfelt, appeal to us down the years. We want to feel the power of those ideals. And Lincoln has come to exemplify those too. I don't mean to keep repeating myself. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, except insofar as it blinds us to the other side of Lincoln that I have tried to present.
Yeah. This question comes from Candace Hooper. Do you believe Lincoln would have been as audacious in Reconstruction had he lived?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I can never prove it. You can never write the history of events that never happened. But you can see in the final months of his life, you can see in the months after his triumphant reelection, in the way he worked to get that 13th Amendment out of Congress, and then toyed with the idea of actually paying off the slave states to ratify it, get it done. You can see it in the way he let stand William Tecumseh Sherman's Special Field Order number 15, setting forth a vast tract of seized plantation lands to be redistributed to former slaves. There was provision in the act establishing the Freedmen's Bureau in March 1865 for the Bureau to begin surveying abandoned and confiscated lands, dividing them, into tracts. This was all preliminary. The titles were to be promissory until more definitive action by Congress made the titles permanent. Lincoln signed it. Lincoln, having surreptitiously opened the door to phasing in Black voting rights in Louisiana a year earlier in the last speech he was ever destined to give, went on and on about Louisiana as a proving ground for Reconstruction. And he talked about the fact that some were disappointed that the Free State Constitution of Louisiana had only empowered the legislature to grant voting rights to Blacks. And then he said, I would myself prefer that those rights had been granted, at least, to those who are especially intelligent and had served our cause as soldiers. But he said the thing to do is not ask whether the experiment in Louisiana is fully satisfactory as it stands. The thing to do is to try to work and make it better. And then he began to get really passionate, saying that if all united behind this experiment, think of the things that could be achieved. He said, the colored man too, and seeing all united for him, is inspired with vigilance and energy and daring to the same end. Translation, he is telling African Americans he wants them to show vigilance and energy and daring in their fight to gain voting rights, and he would help them. It was no accident that John Wilkes Booth, who was there on the White House grounds listening, told one of his accomplices, that's it, that's the last speech he will ever give. I mean,
Right.
the future as it was unfolding showed that Lincoln would have worked closely with the radical Republicans. He was already working with a member of the House, James Ashley of Ohio, to craft a consensus measure on Reconstruction that would open the door to more demanding policies. My hunch is that he would have worked over the summer of 1865 to phase in voting rights for Blacks in Louisiana, and then use Louisiana as a model, to apply in the autumn and winter. And that would just be the beginning.
Right. Yeah, there's significant evidence that he was working behind the scenes in 1864 to try to win Black suffrage in Louisiana, and it didn't work out, but he was trying.
And another dimension of that $400 million, payoff was Lincoln remarked many times that the physical devastation, inflicted on the South was a terrible thing, and that Reconstruction would have to be physical, literal, as well as symbolic. Lincoln was a disciple of Henry Clay. Lincoln was a longtime supporter of internal improvements, public works, as they would later be called.
Sure.
The Civil War Republicans' civilian non-military legislation in the Civil War has been called, blueprint for modern America, starting the Transcontinental Railroad right in the middle of the Civil War. The Homestead Act. I mean, Lincoln was a big advocate of public works, cost no object. It's interesting that in the 1830s, in the Depression that followed the Panic of 1837, Lincoln was making arguments that really anticipated the policies of John Maynard Keynes a century later in the 1930s. Public works deficit finance spending to create an impetus for economic expansion.
Let me ask you about that money that he talked about in 1865 to pay off the South and buy slaves, even at that point, compensated emancipation. His cabinet was absolutely against that. And we got a question from Stephen Gilroy, who said, did any of his cabinet or other associates advise him to appear to be a moderate? Can you talk about his relationship with his cabinet in this regard?
Oh, yes. Throughout the Civil War, William Seward would speak out, whenever he deemed it timely and necessary for Lincoln to take a moderate conciliatory approach. That was his stock in trade, Seward's, by then. And Lincoln was sufficiently shrewd to listen, and at times to take the advice when he thought it was strategically or tactically a good idea. Lincoln certainly did think things through, look at all the different angles, and sometimes turn on a dime, with respect to the course he was pursuing, if it became clear to him that mid-course correction was necessary. Oh, there were a number of members of the cabinet. Seward was the preeminent. Salmon Chase would blow hot and cold. But when it comes to money, it's very important to remember the way the Civil War was financed. It was a monetary triad. of funding: taxation, deficit spending, war bonds, and direct creation of money, the United States notes, Civil War, greenbacks, which were meant to be redeemed in gold. On the front of each note, the text said, "The United States of America will pay." The timing and circumstances of redemption were left vague. But by 1865, there were some people who were beginning to recommend that the greenback should be kept in circulation indefinitely, thus anticipating by a decade the greenbacker position of the 1870s. And the action of Congress in 1878 to forbid the retirement of any more greenbacks. They would be redeemed, people could swap them out for a gold dollar at the branch offices, the sub-treasury offices of the Treasury. But then the notes were not to be destroyed. They were to be stored. And at any time, if tax receipts should be insufficient to cover congressional appropriations, the greenbacks could be spent right out again as circulating funds, see? There were a lot of ideas that were in the air. And Lincoln understood money and banking. He understood money and banking very, very well. And even though Salmon Chase, who as Treasury Secretary had questioned the constitutionality of the Legal Tender Act, made certain that when those United States notes were printed, a portrait of himself was featured on the front of each one.
Right.
So
well, let me ask you another question. I'm going to combine two questions from two different viewers because these have to do with how other people viewed Lincoln.
Yeah.
So Pete Rad asked you to comment on Southern attitudes in the press or in public speeches towards Lincoln. He wrote, they don't really see him as anything but audacious or worse. But then the flip side, Carol Dickerson asks about Frederick Douglass's views of Lincoln. For most of the war, Douglass doesn't see Lincoln as audacious enough. So can you comment on how these different constituencies viewed Lincoln in terms of audacity?
Yes, absolutely. In terms of Southern reactions, and I presume we're talking about Southern white.
Correct.
It's very, very hard to say because ever since the 1830s, under state law, anti-slavery white opinion was suppressed in almost all the slave states. It was a felony, in some cases punishable by death. These slave states were in many ways police states when it came to the suppression of freedom of speech, which was perfectly constitutional under the federal Constitution until the 1920s. The First Amendment says Congress shall pass no law to do various repressive things. It would only be the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment saying no state, shall do this and that, when interpreted in 1925 by the Supreme Court in the case of Gitlow versus New York that applied the First Amendment to the state. So before the Civil War, anti-slavery white opinion in the South, any public expression of support for civil rights for Blacks, absolutely forbidden and punishable. So it's very hard to say how much anti-slavery Southern white opinion there was, how much Southern Unionist opinion there was, just as there were pro-Confederate groups in the North, so-called Copperheads. There were pro-Unionist there was pro-Unionist opinion in the South. One of Lincoln's strategies throughout the Civil War was to try to seek out, and link up to Southern pro-unionism, especially in Appalachiana. But we have very interesting evidence, such as the reactions that were recorded after Richmond fell and after Lincoln, toured Richmond. Not only the outpouring from Richmond African Americans, but from many whites, especially poor whites. There's a story that a white girl handed Lincoln a bouquet of flowers with a card that said, "From Ava to the liberator of the slaves." Who knows how much pro-Lincoln feeling there was in the Confederate South?
Yeah. Let
And
me
as for
ask.
Frederick
Oh,
Douglass
go ahead.
and shall we call them left of center critics, abolitionists, radicals, those who were impatient with Lincoln. Yes, absolutely. Frederick Douglass was one of those until he requested a meeting with Lincoln in August 1863 and got to talk with him and understand his methods better. And then there was the meeting in August 1864 when Lincoln summoned Frederick Douglass to the White House, saying, "I'm afraid we're going to lose, and I want you to organize bands of scouts to get behind enemy lines and spread the word about emancipation so I can free as many as possible while I still have the power."
Yeah.
Douglas's opinion changed, back and forth. And there's a lot of emotion, surrounding these issues, of course. One of the most striking testimonials to Lincoln as an anti-slavery worker came from William Lloyd Garrison, which is very, very surprising because at the outset of Garrison's career as an abolitionist, he was an uncompromising militant who demanded, real purity, moral purity in one's position.
Yeah.
And in the mid 1850s, Garrison called for the free states to secede from the slave states. A very nice, act of moral theatrics, but it wouldn't have freed any slaves. And little by little, in the course of the Civil War, Garrison began to come around. He had once expressed absolute disdain for the use of power, government, coercion, of any kind. It's got to be spiritual. But as he saw Lincoln starting to free them, he came around. And in early 1865, Garrison, in several pieces he wrote for the Liberator, said he did it. It was him. He put it over. He put it over. The rail splitter, the chain breaker from Illinois, who freed them.
So to follow up on that, Joe Simpson asks, should we consider Lincoln an abolitionist by 1865?
It depends on how you define abolitionist. It depends on how you define abolitionist. There had been for years a range of policy positions within the anti-slavery movement. And abolitionist denoted or connoted, absolutism, immediacy, no gradualism. Lincoln had been a gradualist, a follower of Henry Clay in that respect, simply for reasons of what he regarded as practicality and realism. You say all the slaves should be freed immediately. Well, a very nice idea. How? I mean, how is that going to happen? The only practical way, it seemed to him, was to begin a process and then build the strength of it so it could be stretched out and expanded over time. I mean, Great Britain in the 1830s abolished slavery in the West Indies by phasing it out, over 7 years. And Lincoln was a keen observer, of how the British had handled slavery. He was an advocate of gradualism, and the abolitionists, strictly so called, before the Civil War, many of them, Garrison certainly, had absolute contempt for that. But during the Civil War, Lincoln put his gradualism to work. He had, it was hardly unique to him. It was a widely shared vision among Henry Clay type gradualists of paying off the slave owners over time, a voluntary, gradual, compensated process. And in 1862, he was the first president to actually propose that Congress should provide funding for such a thing, and Congress did. And then between March of 1862 and July of 1862, Lincoln invited groups of leaders from the border slave states, the ones that were not under the control of secessionists. He invited them to the White House and almost pleaded with them to give the plan a try, kick-start it in your states to provide a pilot program, a demonstration. And not a single one of them took him up on it.
Right.
Whereupon he decided, very well, then we're just going to switch strategies here. And that was when he decided to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. Instead of starting with the unionist slave states, the border slave states, and get the rebel states later. He decided to flip the sequence, go after it in the rebel states and don't pay them anything, and
Right.
get the others later. Yeah.
Well, we have time, I think, for one more question. And so what I'm going to do is combine two more questions. The first one is a follow-up from the first question from Ed Epstein. And this was, could you comment on how progressive critics of Lincoln today, such as 1619 Project, that paint him as anything but audacious? And related to that, Samuel Black from Dayton, Ohio asks if you could comment on the Lincoln statue controversy. So could you talk about these critics of Lincoln today who are upset with him for not being audacious enough? And do you think there's a way to persuade people that he was?
Well, I hope that there's a way. I don't know. There is something to be said for impatience. There is something to be said for outrage when we behold things that are just, utterly wrong, and they've been around long enough. There's a time for impatience, but there's also a time for patience. It all comes down to the strategic context. And the study of history demands that we try to put ourselves into the position of the people we're talking about and ask ourselves realistically, so far as we can tell, what were the options they had? We say they should have done this or that. What basis do we have for thinking, that about the likelihood of those courses of action? What if they tried and the whole thing had backfired and they wound up 10 times worse? It must be applied to context, applied to specifics, and outraged moral critics are not always very good at doing that. I share the outrage as far as the 1619 Project and Black Lives Matter, and the outrage against the savage racism that shockingly has been on display all around us, within the past year. I'll tell you something. When I'm 70. I lived through I was a kid during the civil rights movement in the 50s, a teenager, during the civil rights movement of the 60s. It seemed to me, as the decades rolled along, that by the 21st century, I thought to myself, we have really come so far. I don't think there's any turning back. And then when Obama was elected, I said to myself, well, there you are, there's the clincher. And my wife said to me, once the Tea Party stuff began and, events unfolded, she said, I think that a lot of this is because he's Black. And I said to her, oh, I don't think so. Look at how far we've come. Our sports teams, some of our biggest sports stars are African American, biggest celebrities in entertainment. She said, that doesn't matter. You just wait. And was she ever right? Was she ever right? I was shocked to see how bad things still are. And in some ways, I have no problem, with emphasizing the uniquely evil legacy of enslavement on this country. I think such an emphasis is quite right. But there's another side to it that is too often neglected. What do you do about it? What have people done that succeeded in making things better? And Lincoln made things a lot better. And I think he should be given great credit for that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Richard. We really appreciate you joining us today. I want to remind viewers at home that you can go to the link in the chat box for the Gettysburg Heritage Center to order Richard's book, Summoned to Glory, and he can sign for you one of our special Lincoln Forum 25th anniversary book plates, and it'll be shipped to you. So please do go to the bookstore and order that. Thank you again, Richard.
Oh, you're welcome.